Welcome everyone. As you know, you're at the History Center and we're really excited to have you here for, this is our last speaker series, and Dallas Eggers, most of you know him, otherwise you wouldn't be here, is speaking. So it will be a great hour plus a few minutes, I'm sure. But we want to thank, first of all the people, our members, and people who just help us make this possible. And I'm going to name some of them. Arrow, Tricia, Tracy, Mary Pat, Linda, Tom, Tim, Chris, Jessica, Susan, Tom and Kathy, they're here, Joe, Coulter Eaton. And like I said, a lot of people just stop in and say, what can I do to help? So we really appreciate all of that. That's great. And also, what can we do to help? They also bring items. So many of the items you see in this exhibit and the exhibit that we had on floods of 65 and the exhibit that we had for schools people brought in items. When they heard that we were going to have, they brought in items. And so these two rooms are filled with river and steamboat items. And just a quick note on that, we will change out some pieces as the year goes on because we have so much to show. So if you said, oh, I saw it already, it'll probably be a little bit different next time you come down. So don't be afraid to come down. Grants also make this happen because we're an all-volunteer organization. So we've had some really nice grants. The first one was from Robert and Alice Smirkard, and that was a family grant in memory of Bob's years on the river, Bob being Robert, her husband, and the love of the community. And then we applied for the J. Mac Gamble grant, and that located in West Virginia, and their grant was to preserve steamboat and towboat history, which is exactly what we're doing here. And finally, the family of Deanna and Ken Rowan. Without their help, this exhibit and show wouldn't be possible either. So besides that, on the other side, when you enter, you saw business communities who are members and who have filled, they've also helped us put these shows on and have a business membership, which really helps our budget. So a couple things before we get started. There's a registry, and I think Shar had you fill your name in already. And then afterwards, if you have time, feel free to wander around and look, because this is the time to do that. And if you're ever interested in joining, which we hope you are, we have membership forms up here, and we also have for each family or each group that's here one of these free booklets, which is very informative and really fun. So, with all that, Dallas will begin his show. Yay.
I thank you, Elise. I think I better do this to begin with. I apologize for turning the cool air off and filling the room with hot air. And so,
it just went down.
are they both? Just went
It
on?
just went down. It says no signal. There you
Yeah, right. So, this is timely. This is on the front page of the Prescott Journal this week. Mayflies invade. You have no idea what a mayfly invasion is unless you've been on a towboat in the middle of the night in the dark when it looks like Star Wars, the first one. Dennis Eaton and I coming through the Hastings Bridge. You got a hooded sweatshirt on, pulled down to here. You got bugs crawling behind my glasses. And if I lie to the pilot, he runs into the bridge. That's what it's like. Underneath the searchlights, the pilot would be up there at night using it. In the morning, the bugs would be 1.5 to 2 feet deep of this squirming mass of insect life. So in the morning, those of you who came to work on the morning watch, I hooked up the fire hose for you, and you got to clean the boat from the top to the bottom every single day. Called Bug Patrol. God, I hated that. They would get back into running gear and stink. So we had an engine room, and we had to make certain that you keep the engine room doors closed. Well, we got a new pilot from down south, and we said, Jerry, you got to keep the engine room doors closed. He didn't. We're going downriver, down just below Wabasha, and the engine died. And David Self, one of the best pilots I've ever known in my entire life, goes, what in the hell is going on? We come down there, and the guy had left the door open. It sucked in enough bugs that it clogged the air cleaners and killed our 900 horsepower engines, and we're going down the river with no power. So mayflies, they told us to hold up below the Wabasha Bridge. because they had snow plows and had to plow it off the bridge, and we were watching tons of bugs. Then they brought sand over top of it. So mayflies are throughout riverboat history, and I don't like them much. So this is today's news. And people wonder, well, how did I get into this? First of all, anybody remember the Avalon coming up? Yes, I figured a few of you would. The Avalon used to come upriver. It was built from the Idlewild. It was changed into an excursion boat. It was a tramp steamer. And it would come upriver. It would play the calliope, and we could hear it. And everybody in town, at least the Rugrats, would run down to the shore, and the Avalon would pull up, and people would go for a ride. And the era of the tramp steamer actually worked for about maybe 30 years. The Avalon quit running in 1962 and became the city of Louisville and sits on the riverfront. So that's how I got interested in steamboats to begin with. Well, then you got this guy, most of you know him, Mark Twain. Great river guy, I've read everything he's written. Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, I reread them this summer. When they talk about log rafts, my bet, with about a 95% certainty, is the log rafts of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn day either came from the St. Croix River or the Chippewa River. Because I checked, I'm also a logging historian, and so you think about it, in those books, they went by Hannibal during when Samuel Clemens was a young man, and so the rafts probably were lumber from here. This guy, we had him last month. Robert Taunton was here portraying George Byron Merrick, Prescott kid. He's in the Steamboat Hall of Fame. He lived on our riverfront. To me, he wrote the best book on the upper Mississippi ever written. And for us who are born and raised here, we know exactly what he's talking about. And so he's another one of the guys that, okay. I didn't start reading about him until a guy named Jim Shealy from town had me said, have you read this? And so I bought the book. My wife was back there, buying books is an addiction. So this is about 1841. This is Henry Lewis. This is the first home here. That is Philander Prescott's home. He was the only European dwelling here. There was one other cabin of a fur trader. Otherwise, there were 20 to 40 Indian teepees and huts. And so he moved here to maintain the claim to Prescott. Because the laws changed, you had to live on the land or you lost your claim. And so he came here to catch the claim. And we've been named after him since 1856. Then we get the flatboat era. Flatboat. It could be as big as this room. Could be a little longer than this room. Some of them carried up to 100 tons. Flatboats were one way. They had no power. They were powered by paddles, poles, ropes, bushwhacking. You think, what in the world is bushwhacking? They would go along the edge of the rivers and pull on the trees to move upriver. Guys, we had a good job, didn't we? Cordelling means that they would put a great big long rope out, and they would actually, I'd put 10 guys out there pulling on the rope to move the flatboat, and you and I are back here, and we're using poles to fend it off, and that's what you did all day. You pulled the flatboat upriver from St. Louis to Fort Snelling, 6 to 8 weeks. In the peak, 4,000 a year went down the river. Most of them came from the Ohio, and they carried product. They carried farm products. They carried skins. They carried honey. They carried berries. They got to New Orleans, and the entire city front of New Orleans was covered with flatboats. And the ocean-going boats would come in, and then the buyers would make their rounds from flatboat to flatboat to flatboat till it was all gone. Then they tore apart the flatboats and sold the lumber. Not all of them, no. Some of them, they didn't think quite met specs. They pushed them into the river. They floated into the Gulf of Mexico. Well, the Gulf currents go this way. The currents took them to the coast of Florida. And so the coast of Florida was covered with wrecked flatboats in the Mississippi River, and there are many homes in Florida that were built from that wood. And so flatboats. There's this guy named Lincoln. He made a flatboat trip in 1930, and actually he holds a river patent for a device to help get him over sandbars. He also, his first goal in life was to be a river pilot. Well, I think he made a pretty good choice. Mr. Lincoln, he comes into our story here again. Then you got a keel boat. A keel boat looks more like what we look at as a Viking ship with the hull. and this type of thing. It looks more like a ship. But again, poles, paddles, cordelling, bushwhacking. Some of them had sails, and a little faster than a flatboat, and a little bigger, carried a little more. They had a deeper hull. And they went all over the place. It's amazing. Our forefathers were tenacious, inventive, and they didn't quit. They figured out how to do things. So the era of keel boats, again, coming upriver, most of the things they carried on the early ones went to the military forts. They went to Fort Crawford, which was in Prairie du Chien. They went to Fort Snelling up here. They went to the fort at Rock Island, and they carried military supplies. They carried negotiators, they carried interpreters, they carried soldiers, they carried food. Well, pretty soon they started carrying people. They started carrying tools, hand tools. That was some of the main things they brought up. But keel boats went all the way up the Missouri. Actually, Missouri is kind of unusual. The inland port in the world that is farthest from the ocean you can possibly get is Great Falls, Montana. 3,500 miles from the mouth of the Mississippi River. That is the farthest on the planet for a navigable waterway. And navigable is not really a good word. And with a lot of sand, a lot of mud, and they got stuck a lot. And so, cordelling. Here you are, guys, this is what we did all day. You can see the guys pushing off on the side, and the rest of them are out there. You waited and you pulled all day. Now you think cordelling was used for this. Well, cordelling was also used for something else. They would take the huge log rafts across Lake Pepin. Well, when you're out here, we had current, and they would go down with current speed, and we had big paddles and kind of controlled them. But you got to Lake Pepin, there was no current. Uh-oh. They cordelled log rafts across Lake Pepin. They put ropes out, and the guys had to pull them across Lake Pepin. Lake Pepin was also the graveyard of log rafts. The log rafts were destroyed by the wind. The banks were covered with logs for miles. Many of the homes in Lake City and southern parts were built from lumber, from log rafts that were destroyed by, they call it the Lake of Death for many reasons. It's called the Ice Gate. Lake Pepin has an earned history, let's put it that way, a well-earned history. Well, we come up. This is that Claremont. 1807, Robert Fulton. We all think, yeah, the first steamboat. No, it wasn't. It was one of the first. A man named John Fitch actually put a steam engine on a flatboat, a modified flatboat keelboat in 1887, and was successful. Just not quite like this. The Claremont would never work here. This was an eastern steamboat because it had a hull that needed 11 to 12 feet. So it was an ocean-going vessel, didn't do well in the Mississippi, and because it had side paddles, it had to be narrow. And so the Claremont, the Claremont, not actually the first. There were a couple more in Europe also. Here's the first one. A man named Roosevelt, we've heard of those people before. He came over the mountains in 1810 to Pittsburgh, and his job, he worked for Mr. Claremont, was to go down the Mississippi or down the Ohio River to New Orleans on a flatboat. So away he went with his wife, who was 20 years old and pregnant. So they waddled through it and this type of thing. She also had her first child out in the middle of nowhere where the nearest town might have been 300 miles. Not a good feeling. But they made it down there. Then he scooted around from New Orleans to New York. He met with the owner of the Claremont, and he said, we can do this. So over the hills he comes to Pittsburgh, and they built the first boat, the New Orleans. The hull was actually done in June or July, but to rig it out and put all the rigging in, it wasn't really ready to launch until November or early December. So early December, he takes off. Actually, probably early October, he takes off from Pittsburgh. And of course, steamboats were not going to work. Everybody in the world said steamboats will never work. They said, we'll never see you again. So he started downriver, and they floated past, and he'd stop at the towns, and they'd say, well, good to see you, but we'll never see you again. Well, down he goes, Cincinnati, all these places. He gets to Louisville. See if I got it here. This is Louisville. This was the falls of the Ohio. Big falls, and he could not navigate it because the water was too shallow. He had to wait for rains. So he pulled up in Louisville and parked, and then he invited all the grand poobahs, like you people, onto the boat at night to eat. So they sit down to a meal, and pretty soon they realize he's cast off, and they're heading upriver. And he kept them on the boat all the way to Cincinnati and back to prove all the naysayers that he was wrong. And so he hung out in Louisville until it rained enough that he could go through the falls. And so he gave rides every couple days in Louisville to the people, and he was there for about 6 weeks. So he finally gets past here, down he comes, all these types of things. He comes out, shooting out of the Ohio River into the Mississippi, and he runs into the largest earthquake in American history. Oh, and by the way, ladies, his wife is pregnant with their second child. This is New Madrid. It still looks like this today. It's a mile across, but it's 20-some miles around it. I've been there a couple times. So what happened was, in December of 1811, earthquakes started. They lasted until March of 1812. 3 months of earthquakes. The San Francisco earthquake was felt over 6,500 square miles. Wow! Pipsqueak. The New Madrid earthquake was felt over 65,000 square miles and rang bells as far away as Boston. The river ran backwards. Entire towns were wiped out. They didn't dare get their boat next to shore because the trees were caving in constantly. But they made it through. Well, they get down a little farther and they end up in the middle of the Osage Indian War. So he's got Indians on both sides of the river shooting arrows at his steamboat. Well, he did make it, and so the New Orleans was the first successful one, and it ran between Memphis and New Orleans until it blew up a few years later. But, wow, in the middle of an earthquake? The first one, this is really kind of a gussied up one. This is really a lot more sophisticated than the original ones. This is supposed to be the Pike. The Zebulon Pike was the first steamboat to come to St. Louis. It came down the Ohio, takes a right, heads for St. Louis. It did not have enough power in a low-pressure steam engine to go up against the current. So guys, we had to pull the stupid thing to St. Louis. So that was the first steamboat to St. Louis. It was under steam power, but they had to pull it also. Well, this is what they say when you go and talk to the robots, and the robot's an idiot. They say that this boat is the Sternwheeler Virginia, the first boat to come up in 1823. No way. There's things in that boat that weren't invented for 20 or 30 years. This isn't an accurate one. But the biggest change was low-pressure steam. That means 15 pounds per square inch. High-pressure steam, 100 to 250 pounds per square inch. Now it's a whole different world. And what happened was we had better steel. We learned how to make better steel instead of cast iron and these types of things. And it's kind of interesting. One drop of water, when it turns from water to steam, expands 1,700 times. So the one drop is this big. And so that is what you see from steam. Well, they kind of blew up. Blowing up was not a good thing, especially because if you're the pilot is usually standing right on top of the boilers. So you could be 100 or 200 yards in the trees, or you could be cut up into hamburger. So that wasn't a good thing. Well, so in 1852, Congress finally said, well, maybe we should do something about all these people being killed. So they passed some laws, but didn't really enforce them on engineers, boilers, pilots, and this type of thing. But the smart ones ended up doing this. This is a steam boiler tester from the 1800s. We didn't even know what it was till we did the research to find out what it is. So it has different spring tensions, and the different spring tensions tell you how much pressure your boiler has. And like I said, this is from the 1800s, and we couldn't figure out what this was. Elise and I looked at this for a half a year. Finally, one of our members got a track and found out this was to test steam engines rather than blow up the boat. So he heads out of St. Louis. You can't go through the rapids, they said. He did. He waited for high water. He was able to get up. They had a high-pressure steam engine, and away they went. There was a gentleman named Giacomo Beltrami There's Beltrami County in Minnesota. He's a famous historian, Italian traveler. He was on the first boat. He was on the Virginia. His job was to document the entire journey. He was stunned. Every day he wrote notes and looked. He got up about to, below La Crosse, maybe 50 miles, and he quit writing. He was stunned by the beauty. He says, I don't want to waste my time writing and miss what's going by. He said it was the most beautiful river in the world. Mark Twain agrees with him, and there's a lot of other people who may. So when you hear Beltrami, he was on the boat. He was on the boat. It's quite a story what they did and how they got here. Well, this one they tell me, this one could be. This is the Palmyra. This came up to St. Croix in 1836. The first boat to really go all the way up to St. Croix was the Palmyra. Now, they say it was the first boat on the St. Croix. No. It was the first boat to go all the way. There were smaller vessels that had gone upriver a little ways and this type of thing. But remember, there were no towns, hardly. There were no towns till the logging industry started. Boat names. This is the Enterprise. There were 4 or 5 Enterprises, and a lot of times they used the same name because you bought a new boat, you had it for a year, it blew up. You just contact them, say, build me the same boat, call it Enterprise 2. And that's what they would do. And so within a couple months, they would have your boat built. So many steamboat names were carried on. There were 5 War Eagles. I think the most was one boat had 12 names on 12 different vessels. So when you see, War Eagle what? War Eagle 2. Tom's relatives came to Stockholm on the War Eagle back in the 1850s. And so names are kind of weird. But the Enterprise, we had this thing in 1862 called the Sioux Uprising. Wasn't a good thing. Philander Prescott, of course, was involved in it. He was the 5th person killed, shot in the back. But, so everybody's afraid of Indians. There's going to be Indians everywhere. They formed brigades in St. Paul that wore fancy red coats and white pants and all this kind of stuff. And they were going to go catch the evil Ojibwe. They caught one drunk Indian who hadn't done anything, and all those guys did is go for a 3-week riding party and drink. But the people along the rivers were afraid. The people in Osceola were afraid of an Indian attack. So what they did is they told the steamboat H.S. Allen that if you hear of Indians, make sure you let us know. And when you go by, blow your horn so that we know there's an Indian attack coming. Okay, sounds good. Dum-dum-dum-dum. Time goes on. It's about a month, 2 o'clock in the morning, the horn sounds, the whistle blows. Half the people left, and the other ones got their guns and ready to fight them off. It wasn't the H.S. Allen, it was the Enterprise blowing his horn to say hi to his buddies who lived in Osceola. There was another Enterprise that came, which is kind of unusual. It came to Green Bay. It came up the Fox River into Lake Winnebago. It got out of Lake Winnebago, continued up the Fox River to where Portage, Wisconsin is, and they had a lock and dam system that Robert Eaton, he was an English lord, brought the Enterprise up that way, down to Wisconsin, came up here, and he hired a guy named George Byron Merrick, who I have mentioned, to be his pilot for the summer. So they went fishing and hunting and up and down and had a great, great time. And then Mr. Eaton left, took his boat, and he left history, and he went back to England. So the Enterprise in names is kind of interesting. This is the Nominee. The Nominee is a famous boat around here. The Nominee was, you saw it in Prescott, you saw it in St. Paul, you saw it in La Crosse. It was the mail boat that went up the Chippewa River every single day. The Chippewa River now is a tough river for a fishing boat. But it was a major steamboat river until about the 1920s, and the Nominee ran every day and delivered mail. And so that was his job. Now, we all think of the logging industry, and I'll mention a little bit. The St. Croix River is responsible for 14 to 15 billion board feet of lumber. Wow, that's a lot. It is, but it ain't the big boy. The big boy was the Chippewa River, 25 billion board feet. And it was pushed down by steamboats. Beef Slough is down by Alma, between Alma and Nelson, was the boom area where they sorted out your logs from your logs from your logs, turned them into giant rafts, and away they would go. So you're thinking, Beef Slough? What's this Beef Slough stuff? Well, there was a steamboat coming up, and it ran on a sandbar, and it had 300 head of cattle on it. So the captain says, get all the cattle off, put them on this island over here. When we get off, we'll go pick them up and continue. Well, they got off, picked up the cattle, but they missed a whole bunch of them. So pretty soon there were a bunch of cattle. And so the people down in the Alma area and that, they would wait for it to freeze in the wintertime, and they would go out hunting cattle for their winter food. So that's why it's called beef slew. Here's the actual ticket. This, and Robert Brakely was a master. The best pilots brought people. If you knew you had the best pilot, you had a lightning pilot, you had the boat with the best food, the best pilots got more people. And you knew who the best pilots were. They tend not to run into stuff. It's kind of like that now in towboats. The ones who run into stuff, you don't want to work for them. I did. There were a couple that I will not mention names to protect the innocent, but he wasn't very innocent. If it held still, he pretty much ran into it. This is our famous painting over here. This is July 4th, 1876. This is the vessel Centennial. It was owned by Colonel Davidson, Captain Davidson from La Crosse, who owned 30 steamboats. And it sank twice this year. It sank in April of 1876 in an ice gorge. People think, what's an ice gorge? Remember, no locks and dams. Get a fast thaw, a quick rain, big rise, the ice would come down a river like a freight train. And in this particular event, this boat and 6 other boats all were sank in St. Louis Harbor by ice. Colonel Davidson was too ornery to let his boat die. He patched it up, pumped it out. They got halfway across, sank again. Well, they patched it up, pumped it out, fixed it, and here it is in Prescott, Wisconsin, 3 months later. So they were pretty persistent. And you can see what our riverfront looked like there then. You've got the Dudley Mill in the background. Notice, ladies, look what they're wearing. They're wearing white frilly dresses and all this type of thing. And it burns wood, it burns coal. I don't know, kind of strange. But at this point, all those people are getting off the boat. Because above the mouth of the St. Croix, there was no water. Might be 2 or 3 feet deep. This boat needed 5.5 feet when it was loaded. So you all had to get off. You slept in hotels, motels, bar floors, haymows, wherever. And there were nights we had almost 1,000 people staying in Prescott till the dinkies showed up. The dinkies are the little guy down in the front there. That's the plowboy. 30 or 40 of the little guys would show up from St. Paul and Stillwater, and you would get on them the next day and continue your journey, and the Centennial would head back downriver. Well, let's take a look at another one. Oh, this is the Centennial in St. Louis, sunk by ice, the boat you just looked at. Oh, here we are. Different boat. Same place, different picture. This is the Rock Island. This is about 2 years later. Our riverfront looks very similar. Hasn't changed a lot. You can see a guy bringing his horse and buggy down there to deliver things. And so this is the Rock Island. And when you look at these boats, they were the development of a style called steamboat Gothic. I call them gingerbread boats or wedding cake boats, but the real true thing is steamboat Gothic. They were stunning, not all of them. Some of them were tramps. Okay, now here's another one. Now this is an unusual one. This is the Quincy. Our riverfront has changed a little bit. It's still very similar, but not exactly the same. The Quincy was an unusual vessel. It got up here, it did a bunch of different things. The Quincy actually was 3 boats. The hull came from the Gem City with a wooden hull. When it sank, the hull was sound. They scavenged the hull. They took the running gear out of the Alex Mitchell, and they built the Quincy. And so away the Quincy goes. And this was a beautiful boat. This is the Musser. Right where we stand or sit right here, there was a walkway that went right straight out towards the bridge so that the steamboats could actually come and park right there, and you could walk right from the walkway onto the boat, onto the second deck. And so Prescott was an accommodating town for steamboats.
That's the Order of Oddfellows building, huh?
Yeah.
Used to be there where the steamboat.
Yeah. And the big building is the Independent Order of Oddfellows Hall. torn down in 1956, I believe. And actually it was built from the remains of a sawmill and 2 warehouses torn down in 1895. And it was our gym, it was our opera house, it was where we played basketball, we had our high school graduations there. So it was quite a place. Remember, our ancestors didn't throw anything away. For goodness sakes, we tore a 2-story school building down and sold the lumber to build a new one. Our ancestors didn't throw much away.
We got the wall clock from that building.
Yeah. And this is what it looks like in 1916. Here's our riverfront. There's not much left. The Dudley Mill is gone. Most of the big ones are gone. Way over here, that was a creamery. It's where Mary Pat House's house is now. And so that's what it looked like. That's a snag boat there. They clean up the river. But this is what our riverfront looked like. That little boat there, that was the first iteration of the boat docks that are down here now. The St. Croix Boat Company, this is the first iteration started by Fred Schmidt, as Chuck Sunby has been teaching me for a few years. Oh, hold it. Here's our Quincy. It's on the bottom of the river. Not good. This is by Trempolo. Here it is again. Same thing, same event. Got cut down by ice, hit a snag, and down it went. And here it is again. Oops. So, learn how to swim before you get on one is a good idea. And there it is in its glory heading up the river. But this is the Quincy in a different skin. When they got the Quincy off the bottom of the river at Trempolo, they sold it to the J.S. Streckfish Company. They tore it all apart and built the JX Deluxe. So inside of that boat is the Quincy. The same running gear, the same hull. They just rebuilt it, renamed it, and it was an excursion boat. So these boats lived weird lives. Some of them had 2 or 3 iterations. The Orinoco, well, that's a big river someplace else. This boat, there were some people that you would know of. They inherited this boat because they made an investment in a lumber company that went broke. The only thing that was left was the boat. The owners were the Mayo brothers from Rochester. This was their personal yacht. They had it all fixed up, and they used it for about 4 to 5 years. And this was and it spent a lot of time here in Prescott. Well, then they moved up. They sold that, and they built this one. This was the Minnesota. This guy standing here in front, that's Charlie Staff from the Prescott Spinner Company. This is the Minnesota. That is the Mayo brothers' second boat. You know, so it was just a little one. This is Prescott. We built boats in Prescott. There were 10 named vessels built here. Many were repaired here. We made a lot of smaller vessels. Hamilton West, Copp is another famous name. Copp's Coulee upriver. Dudley was another famous boat building. John Saxene even owned part of a boat. He was a metallurgist and jewelry maker from Prescott. Steamboats were money makers. You could pay for your boat on a good year if you didn't sink. You could pay for your boat 2 or 3 or 4 times in one season. This is the city front of Prescott too. They're building one of these little, this is either the Pathfinder or the Plowboy being built. This is what Prescott Riverfront, this comes from, you know what the stereopticons are from your childhood, where it's like a binoculars, but they have a photo with 2. This is a stereopticon photo of our riverfront. And you see we have dance halls and all these types of things. So it's just kind of an interesting look because the kids have no idea what a stereopticon is. Here's Prescott from Prescott Island. This is about 1937. That's incorrect. It's not 1937. It has to be 1935 or earlier. Why? Because our 1887 school building is still up right there. It burned in December 1935, so that would be me, put the wrong date on here. And what has happened is Mary Beeler, the true historian, has taught me to look into the background of the photos. Most people, we see the main thing, but we don't look behind it and see it. Well, now that I look at it, oh, okay. But that's what we looked like in about 1935. Catholic Church is in place. Here we are, Merkard Mill. My home was built from the remains of that mill. It burned in 1920. So I live in a 105-year-old money pit. The oldest wood came to Prescott in 1862. So you think, Chippewa River, this is Durand, Wisconsin. Log rafts going by Durand, Wisconsin. People don't think of Durand as a logging, but remember, the big logging river was the Chippewa. And by the way, if you ever get to Durand, go to the Corral Bar in the Riverside Restaurant. I have to mention, Tom's shaking his head, I got to mention this. They have a lithograph from 1885 that's 50 feet long, 9 feet high, from 1885. It's still on the wall. It advertises a circus, and it's on this side going upriver, up the Chippewa, and people say, why? The biggest city close by was Eau Claire. So they came from Eau Claire on steamboats to go to the circus and then went back home. 2 years later, they built a building right next to it and covered it up. In 2015, they bought the old place and were going to turn it into an event center, started to tear through the walls, and my buddy that I graduated from high school, he said there was a buffalo staring at us. So thank goodness they called the Wisconsin Historical Society. They came up, cleaned it all up. It all sits behind glass and it's lit up, and you can look at it this far away. So some great history in Durand, Wisconsin, right on the banks of the Chippewa. This is Prescott. Now, I'm not staying with steamboats because I know a lot of you are from here, but here's our 1886 bridge going across, steam engine, and you notice that it's up on trestles. It's not the dirt we see now. The trestles went into Minnesota half a mile because what we know as Point Douglas flooded every spring. Every spring. And most of us remember that, driving through it in 1965, walking across the railroad bridge. But here's my house, the mill. There was a ferry that ran right across here into Hastings. There were 2 ferries in Hastings, one was here. There's still some old foundations back there. If you're young enough and chipper enough to get back and dig around in the mud, it's still there. Here's another look at it. Okay, you can see the ferry house right here. It goes right across into Hastings. And so this is what Prescott looked like. And no, this building is gone. This building is gone. This one is still here. All these are gone. This is Point Douglas, because remember, Point Douglas was challenging us in the 1800s. Point Douglas was going to be the big city. Well, and because it flooded every spring, it ended up as us. And Point Douglas dwindled, and we took over. So this is the wintertime, and you see way back over here, there's a boat tucked in for the winter. They would sit it there, as people in Prescott have done forever. They would bring their boat docks down, and they put their boat docks there. We took the diving board from the beach, and we'd put it there, because the current doesn't get it, the ice doesn't get it, so they just park it there for the winter. Because you can't get through Lake Pepin. All right, here we are again. This is the HS Lamb. The Lamb Company was a logging company out of Iowa. The other one is the Bun Hershey going down here, pushing a log raft. So I'm coming up this side, and there's a log raft going down the other side. Give you an idea how big a log raft is. The biggest one in history, 256 feet wide, 1,910 feet long. The longest barges you will see out here with the boat are 1,200 feet. If you think of a log raft that big, 1,910 feet long. And of course, some of the first pilots to push log rafts downriver were from where? Right here in Prescott. We have been famous for river pilots since day one, pretty much. Okay, commercial fishing. Here we are, the Moose and Little Moose. They were commercial fishing vessels they used for sailing when there wasn't ice. And according to the historians, the biggest catch in a single day, 2 guys brought in 50,000 pounds of fish, and it took them 3 days to box them up and load them up. We shipped them out on trains, we shipped them out on boats. They used to eat them. Yeah. Now, no thank you. Now they don't. But commercial fishing here was a big thing. This is St. Paul. This is the St. Paul city front. This is about 1857. The first high bridge is going across behind there. You can see that. This is the Lake Superior. Somebody's moving. This is the Lookout. The Lookout is the next generation. It isn't quite steamboat Gothic, but it's much different. It's sleek, it was fast, it was efficient, and it was one of the quickest boats on the upper Mississippi. So this is the Lookout. Now we moved over to the crookedest river in the United States, is what they call it. That's the St. Peter River, which is now called the Minnesota. And they said to go from here to here was 20 miles by river, was 3 miles straight. 300 miles like this. And so the steamboat era, they had to make them smaller. The boats unloaded on the Minnesota River only drew 14 inches of water, this much. And when they were loaded, they would draw 2.5 to 3 feet. And the steamboat era on the Minnesota River really only lasted about 20 years. And of course, steamboat pilots are always kind of pushing the envelope. So we had steamboat pilots thought they could go up the Minnesota, through Travers Lake, all the way, and hit the Red River of the North and go all the way into Canada. They tried it twice. They came back in canoes. This is the Lorena, another little bitty tiny one. This is in Mankato. And so they made small boats for small rivers. And as a farmer, you needed transportation. The main thing they were carrying now was wheat. Thousands and thousands of tons of wheat a year went downriver. Once we got enough Swedes and Germans and Irishmen here to tear out all the stumps, the wheat took over. This is one of my favorite vessels. This is the Gray Eagle, piloted by Daniel Smith Harris. This is the fastest certified boat in steamboat history. Averaged 16.5 miles an hour upriver against the current, and it had to stop to get wood 5 times. So it was averaging over 20 miles an hour. And then people would say, oh, modern towboats go faster than that. No, they don't. If you're going 11 miles an hour in a towboat, your hair's on fire. Because you can't stop. You can't stop. So the Gray Eagle was designed by Daniel Smith Harris. He was a lightning pilot. He challenged the envelope every single day. And so up and down, and I would race you, and when I win, I get the broom. No one ever took the broom from him. He won every race. Now, what I'm telling you is pure myth, but it's a great myth. So the Civil War was starting. Daniel Smith Harris was kind of neutral, and he heard a rumor to say that since he had the fastest boat on the rivers, there was some people in the Confederacy who were going to steal his boat. The leader of the band was a gentleman named Quantrell, who led Quantrell's Raiders in the Civil War. And the myth says that Daniel Smith Harris hit the Rock Island Bridge intentionally to sink his vessel to keep it out of the hands of the Confederacy. Is it true? I don't know, but it's a really neat story. Key City, one of my favorite vessels. This went up the Missouri, went up the Ohio, up the St. Croix, all over the place. This was a fabulous boat, actually a pretty quick boat. So I'm the pilot on here, and I'm sitting at a bar in Hudson, and I've had a couple barley pops, and there's another pilot on his boat who thinks his boat's pretty fast too. So they challenged each other to a race the very next day, from Hudson to see who could make the turn upriver at Prescott. So they got ready, and away they went. Through the Narrows at Hudson, down around Catfish Point, through the Kinnickinnick. They got down here. The engineer on the Key West was Wiley. He kept 2 55-gallon drums of pine pitch that he could throw in to get extra heat, and he won by 100 feet because he threw the pine pitch in at the right time. So the Key City won the race. This is the race everybody hears about. Robert E. Lee and the Natchez. They were a matched race, left New Orleans. They were prepped to run. They had called ahead to find wood, to make sure the woodlots had wood and this type of thing. And away they went. Captain Leathers and Captain Cannon, and back and forth they went, except that the Natchez had a leak in a steam line. So he kind of had to fiddle around, then he'd catch up, then he'd fiddle around again. Well, they were pretty much neck and neck when they got to Cairo, Illinois, which is the mouth of the Ohio. It was fog. The pilot of the Natchez pulled in the fog. Captain Cannon on the Robert E. Lee slow-belled and went as slow as he could, and he ended up winning by 6 hours because he drove through the fog. So that is the story of the Natchez. But it's a little weirder than that. So you've got wood to burn, you've got some coal to burn. Now what they did is they called ahead. Now, how did they do that? How did they contact people upriver? Telegraphs. So they telegraphed and had all the farmers in meat markets collect all their lard, ham, bacon grease, and they would come to these towns and they would bring cartloads of bacon and ham, and they would burn them in the boilers to get a hotter fire. And they said during the race, the entire Mississippi Valley smelled like a breakfast brunch. But we always think here. How about the Colorado River? Colorado River steamboats were important, very important. Now the Colorado has a tough time having enough water to even run. This is a basic steamboat that was built, not much there, a deck, steam oiler, and a wheel in the back. Colorado River on St. George, Utah, on the Virgin River. Most of the steamboat pilots and workers in Colorado River were Mormons. They owned half of the boats or more. So this is actually in Colorado. One of my buddies in Colorado, he was in Arizona, and there was a steamboat sitting in a junkyard in Arizona to this day. So we don't think about, north to Alaska to find the gold. Well, they went over the passes and all this kind of stuff. The smart people took a boat. And so it was a 4,000-mile voyage from San Francisco up to the Yukon. And for years and years, steamboats traversed the Yukon River. There were no roads. The state of Alaska ran ferries up and down the Yukon River until the 1960s. And so steamboats were important, very important. Oops. This is the reality. Most steamboats, average life, 5 years. Oops, they didn't last long. Some 2 weeks, some a couple years, some 20. But when your boat looks like that, that probably isn't good. Then when there's people walking on the dirt outside of your boat, you're probably not where you need to be. And you notice that it's kind of humpbacked like this. That's called hogback. They broke its keel. Once the keel is broken, the boat has to be destroyed. So this one was pretty much scrapped out. I don't have a photo, but there was a guy down between Wabasha and Winona in Minneska. He built a home out of wrecked steamboats called Gray's Castle. And there's a photo on the other side that you can't see tonight. He raised 4 children in there. There's nothing left. But he built it. It looks like steamboat Gothic and meets the Munsters. This is another one. There you are. Now you can see over here where the boats really are. And this guy. Oops. And notice there's very few trees. We denuded our rivers. The Ohio River Valley made 4,000 to 6,000 steamboats. And so pretty soon it got to where they wouldn't let them build the hulls out of wood because there were no trees. Well, we did the same thing on the Chippewa River. That's why it all filled in. The Galena River, which was called the Fever River, we did the same thing. Lead mines. We cut all the trees down. It all eroded. Now the river was 400 feet wide. Now it's 80. We didn't know. Upper Mississippi. We changed the entire hydrologic cycle of the Upper Mississippi River with steamboats. Oops, another one. I sunk. June 24th, 1914. And people say, what do you mean by denuding them? A big steamboat used 25 cords of wood per day, every day, sometimes twice a day. And so you think about how many trees that would take. There were 300 to 400 major steamboats running on the Mississippi River system most of the years. That means the Ohio River, Lower Mississippi, Upper Mississippi River, all of the river systems, 350 to 400 of the big boys, and then a herd of the little guys. And most of them burned wood. They started burning coal in the 1850s, 1860s, but wood was cheap. And you had guys who were out, beavers were out cutting wood and piling it on the banks, and so they burned wood, but coal was always there. Steamboat on the Missouri. It's using spars. Now spars are these things way out in the front here. They almost look like cricket legs. They would go out like this, and they would pull your boat over the sandbar. And then you reset, you pull them again. They had a steam-driven capstan on the front that drove the capstan, plus it drove the doctor. And I thought, what's this doctor? It was a pump that pumped steam, and it was used to pump water for all kinds of things, for your boilers and this type of thing, but it was a doctor, and it was a little bitty steam engine to do nothing but run pumps and capstans. And so that's kind of what Abraham Lincoln was doing. Steamboats traveled up the Arkansas River. Steamboats were part of some of the most horrific history in the United States. We moved the Native Americans. They didn't all walk. A lot of them rode steamboats to the reservations, and they were taken to Oklahoma on steamboats. And they originally came up out of lower Tennessee and Alabama on steamboats coming up the Cumberland and Tennessee River. Then they came down and hopped on a different boat and went to Oklahoma on steamboats. So they didn't all walk. So now I got to tell you a weird story. This is a steamboat. It's named the Yavari. And it was first, I'm the king of Peru. I have lots of money. I want to control Lake Titicaca. So I'm going to take all the money I made selling bird poop, and I'm going to buy a military vessel so I can dominate Lake Titicaca. So the king of Peru bought a steamboat in England in 1862. They put it together with screws. When it was all done, they took it apart. They loaded it into packages that could weigh no more than 350 pounds, 2,700 in some of them. Put it on a boat around Tierra del Foot, and his military came up there with their boats and pretty much had their way with Fort Henry, and they gave up in about 2 hours. Now, Fort Donelson is only 12 miles away, but they didn't get there for days because they used those boats to go up the Tennessee. They destroyed bridges, they destroyed boats, they destroyed railroads, so the Union Army went up the Tennessee River and wiped out everything that the Confederates could use. Then, when they were done with that, they went up, took a right, and they came up to Cumberland. Fort Donelson was prepared, though. They were higher up, sat in a good place, the cannons had better range, they had ammunition. The fleet didn't do very well. But this guy named Grant showed up on their back door, and they didn't last long, because he showed up with 40,000 troops. So now, we control the Tennessee, we control the Cumberland. That was a tremendous step in the Civil War, because now, rather than carrying everything by horse or by wagon, we can carry our supplies on steamboats. So now we can get our supplies 350 miles closer to the battlefronts. When they went to attack Atlanta, and the Atlantas marched to the sea, they used the steamboats to bring the supplies as close to Atlanta as they could possibly get them. And so steamboats were really quite a thing in the Civil War. You don't hear much about it, but they were very important. Now, this is the stern wheeler at Steel City. We're going to go back into the steamboat Gothic boats. You can see they're dancing a bit. They always got their out front. Kate Adams, this is a classic boat. They've got the crenellated. Those, of course, you know that the chimneys are hinged, so when they go into low bridges, they can lay them down. The Delta Queen, when it was up here, had that same thing, as did the American Queen. They make it with a hinge, and you can lay them down. This is the Twin City. This is a boat from around here. This is the basic little boat from around here. Log rafter, packet boat, ferry. This is the J.M. White. This is the most luxurious one ever built. It was gorgeous. 315 feet long, 100 and some feet wide. The President, a little shorter. The Red Cloud. This is up the St. Croix. This is right behind Afton, the Juanita. This is the interior of the steamboats. They were gorgeous. The people who rode these steamboats were spoiled rotten. It was probably the most luxurious time of their life. This is a real boat. White tablecloths, silverware, glass. Here's your room. And this is from an 1880s vessel. So you had a nice bed. You had a sink there, hot water, and it wasn't river water. They drank a lot of alcohol and beer because the river water wasn't really great, unless you wanted to grow cattle. And this is what the pilot house looked like. And this steering wheel is 12 feet across. And in heavy winds and heavy current, the pilot would be there and two people would help him steer the boat because they didn't have hydraulics. This is all done by ropes and cables. So it has to be done by muscle power.
About the Avalon, when it came up, I remember as a kid coming up in St. Paul.
Yep.
What was that? What kind of steamboat was that?
It was. I mentioned it came as the Idlewild, which was built just at like 1912. It was a steam vessel. Then when the Idlewild had some difficulties and the engine blew up, they replaced engines with diesels. And then after that, it became a tramp steamer. In other words, it would just cruise up to some, you'd hear Calliope and you'd come down and go for a cruise. And it did that successfully for almost 20 years. It just boomed around and...
When was the last time when was it taken out of commission?
Well, the last time it came up here was 1962. It was sold to Louisville, Kentucky the very next year. And today it sits on the bank in Louisville, Kentucky on the bank of the river. So it's kind of with us. Kind of with us. Not completely. Yes, sir.
How many had Calliope?
We had Calliopes. Not a lot. We hear Calliopes and all this type of thing. And oh, Calliopes. Can you imagine what it would be stuck on a boat from St. Louis to St. Paul with a Calliope playing all day?